when the woman said, "You taught me how to live again." The 67-year-old host couldn't hold back his tears. The studio went silent. Every camera stopped moving. The audience, which seconds ago had been roaring with laughter, froze in their seats. Steve Harvey, the man who had made millions laugh for 3 decades, stood motionless in the center of the Family Feud stage, his microphone hanging loosely at his side, tears streaming down his face. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't one of his legendary comebacks or perfectly timed punchlines. This was something else entirely. Something raw. Something real. And nobody in that studio, or watching at home, was prepared for what happened next. But to understand this moment, we need to go back. Back to where it all started. It was a Tuesday afternoon taping at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta, Georgia. The energy was electric, as it always was. 2 families stood at their podiums, the Martinez family from Texas, wearing matching red shirts, and the Patterson family from Ohio, sporting blue. Standard setup. Standard game. Or so everyone thought. Steve Harvey walked onto the stage with his signature swagger, perfectly tailored 3-piece suit, that trademark grin spreading across his face. The audience erupted. This was what they came for, Steve's larger-than-life personality. His quick wit, his ability to turn even the most mundane survey answer into comedy gold. The first few rounds went exactly as planned. Families buzzed in, gave hilariously wrong answers, and Steve did what Steve does best. He played off every moment with impeccable timing. The crew was already marking this as a solid episode. Good energy, good laughs, good television. But then came round 4. As the Martinez family huddled to discuss their strategy, Steve did what he often does during breaks. He scanned the audience. Not looking for anything in particular, just connecting with people, making eye contact, feeding off their energy. That's when he saw her. A woman, probably mid-40s, sitting in the 3rd row. She wasn't laughing like everyone else. She wasn't smiling. She was just watching. Watching him with an intensity that made him pause. Her hands were folded in her lap, and even from the stage Steve could see something in her eyes. Something that looked like pain. Or maybe hope. Or both. Steve stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The producers in the control room immediately noticed. "What's happening?" one whispered into her headset. Steve Harvey never breaks character. Never stops the flow. But here he was, standing completely still, staring into the audience. The woman noticed his gaze. Their eyes locked. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a connection that transcended the bright lights and cameras and the game show format. Steve did something then that he'd never done in 30 years of hosting. He put down his cards, stepped away from the podiums, and walked toward the audience. The families looked at each other, confused. The audience murmured. The director frantically tried to figure out if this was planned. It wasn't. Steve walked down the stage steps, past the 1st row, and stopped directly in front of the woman. Up close, he could see it even more clearly now, the weight she was carrying. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying recently. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped a small purse. "Ma'am," Steve said, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it on this show. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up at him, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The entire studio held its breath. Finally she nodded, but her eyes told a different story. "What's your name?" Steve asked gently. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Mitchell." "Sarah, I see you," Steve said, crouching down to her level so they were eye to eye. "I don't know what you're going through, but I see you. And you're here for a reason." That's when Sarah broke. Tears started flowing down her cheeks, and she covered her face with her hands. The woman next to her, later identified as her sister, wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Steve didn't move. He stayed right there, patient, present, waiting. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. When Sarah finally looked up, she took a shaky breath and began to speak. And what she said would change everything. Mr. Harvey, she started, her voice barely audible even with the boom mics now positioned closer. 6 months ago, I lost my daughter. The studio went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock, but the kind that comes from collective heartbreak. Even the crew members, who'd seen thousands of tapings, felt it. She was 16. Sarah continued, tears streaming freely now. Cancer. And after she died, I couldn't function. I couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. I didn't want to be here anymore. I just wanted to be with her. Steve's jaw tightened. His own eyes were beginning to glisten. My sister. Sarah gestured to the woman beside her. She forced me to come here today. I didn't want to. I haven't left my house in months except for therapy appointments. But she said, Sarah, you need to remember what joy feels like. And I didn't think I could. I didn't think I'd ever feel anything again. She paused, looking directly into Steve's eyes. But then I saw you. I heard you laugh. I watched you connect with those families up there. And for the first time in 6 months, I smiled. Just a little. And then I laughed. Actually laughed. And I realized. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. I realized my daughter would want me to live. Really live. Not just exist. And you taught me how to do that again. Even just for today. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Time seemed to stop. Steve Harvey, the man who'd built a career on quick comebacks and never missing a beat, had no words. For maybe the first time in his professional life, he was completely speechless. Then, slowly, he stood up. He looked at Sarah, then at the cameras, then at the families still standing at their podiums. And he did something that would become legendary in television history. He took off his jacket. The expensive, perfectly tailored, custom-made jacket that was part of his signature look. He folded it carefully and handed it to Sarah. This, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, is yours. Not because it's expensive. Not because it's from me. But because when you wear it, I want you to remember that your daughter's love is still wrapped around you. And that love doesn't end. It transforms. It becomes strength. Sarah took the jacket with trembling hands, holding it against her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Her sister was crying now too. So was half the audience. Camera operators were wiping their eyes. Even the contestant families had abandoned their positions to watch this moment unfold. But Steve wasn't done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Not a fancy one, just a simple white card with a phone number. This is my personal assistant's number, Steve said. You call that number whenever you need to. Whenever the darkness gets too heavy. Whenever you forget what joy feels like. You call, and we'll figure it out together. You're not alone in this, Sarah. Not anymore. Then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He knelt down in front of her chair, took both her hands in his, and prayed. Right there. On live television. With cameras rolling. Lord, Steve began, his voice steady despite the tears running down his face. This is one of your children who's hurting. And I'm asking you, no, I'm begging you, to wrap your arms around her right now. Let her feel her daughter's spirit. Let her know that grief and joy can coexist. That she can honor her baby's memory by living fully. Give her the strength to wake up tomorrow and the day after that, and the day after that. Amen. Amen. Echoed through the studio like a wave. When Steve stood up, something had shifted. Not just in Sarah, but in everyone present. The Martinez family and the Patterson family, who minutes ago had been competitors, both walked off their podiums and surrounded Sarah. They hugged her. They cried with her. This wasn't about a game anymore. This was about humanity. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. The director, who'd been frantically trying to figure out how to salvage the taping, made a decision. Keep rolling. This was bigger than an episode. This was television history. Steve looked at both families. "We're going to do something different today," he announced. "We're not finishing this game. Both families win. Full prize money. Both of you." The families erupted in cheers, but they immediately directed their celebration towards Sarah, including her in their joy. It was as if the entire studio had become one family. Steve turned to the audience. "Some of you came here today thinking you'd just watch a game show. But I think God had a different plan. I think Sarah was supposed to be here. And I think all of us were supposed to witness this. Because this," he gestured around the studio, "this is what life is really about. Not the money. Not the fame. Not the perfect answers. It's about seeing each other. Really seeing each other. And showing up when it matters." The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted 5 full minutes. Production assistants would later say they'd never seen anything like it. People weren't just clapping, they were crying, hugging strangers, calling their loved ones. Sarah sat in her seat, Steve's jacket draped over her shoulders, surrounded by her sister and 2 families of complete strangers who'd become friends in an instant. She was still crying, but now there was something else in her expression. Something that hadn't been there before. Hope. After the taping ended, or rather, after it transformed into something else entirely, Steve did something he'd never done before. He stayed. Usually, he'd film the next episode or head to his next obligation. But that day, he stayed for 2 hours. He talked with Sarah and her sister. He met audience members who'd been touched by the moment. He took photos, signed autographs, but more importantly, he listened. He heard stories of loss, of pain, of people barely holding on. And for each person, he had time. He had presence. He had words of encouragement, or sometimes just a hug. One of the production assistants, a young woman named Jessica who'd worked on the show for 3 years, pulled Steve aside as he was finally about to leave. "I've worked here since the beginning," she said. "And I've never seen you do anything like that. What made today different?" Steve thought for a moment. "I don't know if it was different," he finally said. "Maybe I just finally paid attention to what was always there. We get so caught up in the format, the jokes, the pace. But at the end of the day, we're just people in a room together. And sometimes people need more than laughter. Sometimes they need to be seen. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten." The episode never aired. At least, not in the traditional sense. The network made the decision to release the raw footage with minimal editing as a special segment. No laugh track. No commercial breaks. Just the moment, preserved as it happened. It went viral within hours. Not because it was scandalous or shocking, but because it was real. People shared it with messages like, "This is why Steve Harvey is more than a host," and "This is what television should be." Sarah Mitchell's story spread across the internet. People reached out to her with their own stories of loss and survival. She started a support group in her hometown for parents who'd lost children. She named it Living Again, inspired by what she told Steve that day. 3 months later, Sarah sent Steve a photo. It was her, wearing his jacket, at the first meeting of her support group. 15 parents filled the room behind her. In the photo, she was smiling. Really smiling. Steve framed that photo and kept it in his dressing room. Whenever he had a bad day, whenever the pressure of show business got too heavy, he'd look at that picture and remember why he does what he does. But the impact went even deeper than that. The Patterson and Martinez families stayed in touch with Sarah. They visited her support group. They shared their own struggles, different from Sarah's, but struggles nonetheless. What had started as a game show competition had transformed into a genuine community of support. Steve himself changed too. In interviews after that day, he talked openly about the experience. "I thought I was there to host a show," he'd say. "But really, I was there to be a witness to someone's healing. And that jacket? That wasn't charity. That was a transaction of the soul. She gave me a reminder of what matters, and I gave her a symbol that she wasn't alone." He started doing something new in his tapings after that. Before each show, he'd take a moment to really look at the audience. Not just scan them, but see them. And every so often, he'd spot someone who needed to be seen, and he'd break the format again. Not always as dramatically, but always meaningfully. The jacket became symbolic in ways nobody expected. Sarah still wears it to every support group meeting. And every time someone new walks through those doors, carrying the unbearable weight of loss, she wraps them in that same jacket and says the words that saved her life. You taught me how to live again. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is stop. Stop the show. Stop the script. Stop pretending everything is fine. And just see someone. Really see them. Steve Harvey did that. And in doing so, he reminded all of us what it means to be human.